I want you to close your eyes for a second. Just imagine you are standing in the very center of a dazzling, bustling metropolis.
Oh, it's such a striking image to start with.
Right. But this isn't just any city. It is built entirely on water.
Yeah, completely aquatic.
You look around and see this massive network of canals acting as streets, with canoes silently gliding by, laden with all these exotic goods.
It's like Venice, but, in Mesoamerica.
Exactly. You see gleaming white temples reaching up into the sky, their walls plastered and painted in these brilliant colors. Lush, floating gardens stretching out toward the horizon.
But we are talking about a huge population here, right?
Yeah, you were standing in a city of nearly 250,000 people.
Yeah.
A place that rivaled and honestly, in many ways, vastly surpassed the beauty, the sanitation, and the engineering of contemporary European cities like Paris.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. You are in Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of the Aztec Empire.
It is a breathtaking image to conjure up, and I think it completely shatters the preconceived notions most of us carry around.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you hear the word Aztec, a magnificent, hyper-organized, aquatic city with botanical gardens and street sweepers just isn't the first thing that jumps into your mind.
No, not at all. If you look at the history books that have dominated the narrative for, well, the last 500 years, the image you get is entirely different.
It's incredibly dark.
Right, it's just blood-soaked. We picture endless lines of terrified captives being marched up steep pyramid steps. We think of gruesome rituals with obsidian knives and a society that seems completely, almost irrationally obsessed with death.
Yeah, it's a very binary cinematic villain framing, like something out of a movie.
Exactly. But that framing is largely a product of the people who conquered them. History is written by the victors, right?
As the old cliche goes, yes. But when we actually look at the modern archaeological evidence, and when we critically read the indigenous texts alongside the colonial Spanish chronicles, well, that X-ray machine we use to view history starts to show a much more complex and, frankly, a much murkier picture.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are going to deconstruct the rise, the incredibly intricate culture, and the ultimate tragic fall of the Aztec Empire.
There is so much to cover.
There really is. We're going to look specifically at a fascinating and highly misunderstood phenomenon known as the Flower Wars.
Which is just a crazy concept once you get into it.
Oh, it's mind-blowing. And most importantly, we're going to critically examine the sources we've gathered to ask a massive question. Were the gruesome tales of mass human sacrifice and cannibalism the everyday reality they were claimed to be?
Or were they something else entirely?
Right. Were they, at least in part, a calculated propaganda campaign by Spanish conquerors designed to legally and morally justify their violent subjugation of indigenous peoples?
That distinction is just critical to make. And I want to be very clear with you, the listener, right from the start of this deep dive.
Yeah, we have to set the ground rules here.
Exactly. As we navigate these incredibly heavy historical and political narratives today, we are going to maintain strict impartiality. We are simply reporting the perspectives, the academic debates, and the archaeological findings exactly as they are presented in the vast stack of sources we've compiled.
We aren't here to take sides between the empires of the 16th century.
No, not at all. We are here to understand how a historical narrative gets built, how it gets weaponized, and what the physical evidence actually tells us.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's go all the way back at the beginning. Because before they were an empire, they had to actually build that floating city.
Which is a whole saga in itself.
Right. How does a group of people end up building a massive metropolis on a swampy lake in the first place? According to the sources, the Mexica, which, by the way, is the actual name for the people we colloquially call the Aztecs today, they didn't start out as the dominant power in Mesoamerica at all.
Far from it. The story of the Mexica is one of a rapid, almost unprecedented, and highly improbable transformation.
Yeah, they were basically underdogs.
Huge underdogs. If we rewind to the early 14th century, they were essentially a nomadic tribe. Their origin stories say they migrated from a mythical, semi-arid homeland in the north called Aztlan.
Right.
Now, when they finally arrived in the Valley of Mexico after generations of wandering, they didn't find an empty, pristine wilderness just waiting to be settled.
No, the valley was prime real estate. It was already heavily populated, filled with these established, powerful and bustling city-states that had been there for centuries.
Yeah, they were walking into a crowded room.
Exactly. The Mexica were the newcomers.
Yeah.
The outsiders. the uncultured upstarts from the north, basically.
And they were heavily marginalized because of it. The established powers completely looked down on them. The sources actually note that the Mexica basically had to sell their services as mercenaries to the more powerful civilizations already living there.
So they were basically guns for hire. Well, Obsidian clubs for hire.
Exactly. They were highly skilled, ferocious warriors, but they were landless. They were a warlike group acting as a hired military force for local kings.
Which is a dangerous way to live.
Very.
All right.
But it allowed them to accumulate critical military experience and this terrifying reputation over time.
But they kept getting kicked out of the lands they were allowed to temporarily settle, right?
They weren't great house guests.
Usually because they offended their hosts in some brutal way. So eventually, the sources say, in 1325 CE, they are pushed into the absolutely least desirable land in the entire valley.
The absolute bottom of the barrel.
A swampy, snake-infested island in the middle of the brackish Lake Texcoco.
But according to their founding legend, they saw a divine sign there. An eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus devouring a snake.
Which is on the Mexican flag today.
Right, exactly. Their patron god had told them this specific omen would mark the place where they were meant to build their permanent home. So that muddy island became the foundation of Tenochtitlan.
I really want to dig into the logistics of this, because building a city on a swamp is just an incredible feat of engineering.
Oh, it's staggering.
How do you actually do that without modern machinery?
Right.
I mean, you can't just throw up stone temples on mud. They would sink.
You can't. You have to fundamentally alter the landscape. To build the foundations for those massive stone pyramids, they drove thousands of huge wooden pylons deep into the lake bed.
Wow.
Yeah, they packed them tightly together to create a stable platform, and then they used a volcanic stone called tezontle.
Tezontle.
It's incredibly light and porous, almost like pumice, and they used that to build the structure so they wouldn't just sink into the swamp under their own weight.
That is brilliant. But then there's the food problem. You are on an island. You can't exactly farm mud.
Which leads to one of their most brilliant innovations, according to the texts, the chinampas, or floating gardens.
Floating gardens. How did those work?
They would stake out these rectangular enclosures in the shallow lake bed, weave branches and reeds between the stakes like a giant basket, and then dredge up the nutrient-rich muck from the bottom of the lake to fill the enclosure.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they just piled alternating layers of mud and decaying vegetation until it breached the surface of the water.
So they essentially manufactured artificial, incredibly fertile farmland right on the surface of the lake.
Exact.
The sources say these chainappas could yield up to 7 harvests a year because the roots of the plants had constant year-round access to water.
It became an absolute agricultural powerhouse. And they also built massive causeways, these elevated roads spanning miles across the water, connecting the island to the mainland.
So they weren't just trapped out there.
No, they were highly connected. They built intricate stone aqueducts to bring fresh spring water into the city because the lake water surrounding them was saline. They engineered massive dikes to control flooding. It is a true testament to human ingenuity.
It really is.
But even with all this engineering marvel, in the 1300s, they still weren't an empire yet. They were a vassal state.
Right. They were still paying rent, basically.
Heavy, humiliating tribute to other, much stronger powers, specifically the Teutonic civilization.
So how do they flip the script? How do the vassals become the emperors?
The true turning point arrives in 1428. The Mexica, having grown significantly in population, wealth, and military might on their island fortress, they just decided they had had enough of the Teutonic overlords.
It was time to rebel.
Yeah. They formed a highly strategic political and military coalition. This is known as the Triple Alliance.
Okay, the Triple Alliance.
It consisted of Tenochtitlan, the nearby city-state of Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Together, these three powers waged a massive war, overthrew the Tepanecs, and began a campaign of aggressive, relentless expansion.
Let's talk about the mechanics of this empire, because when we say Aztec Empire, we are really talking about this Triple Alliance, right?
Yes, with Tenochtitlan eventually rising to become the dominant senior partner of the three.
Right. So they started conquering neighboring city-states across central and southern Mexico. But it's crucial to understand how they ruled, because it's not like the Roman Empire.
Not at all.
They didn't usually establish massive military garrisons in every conquered town, or force everyone to speak Nahuatl, or make them adopt Mexica customs.
The term historians use is a hegemonic empire, as opposed to a territorial empire. They ruled through indirect means and, well, the constant threat of overwhelming force.
Yeah, the threat was the key.
Exactly. When the Triple Alliance conquered a city-state, an altipetal, as it's called in their language, they generally allowed the local rulers to stay in power. They didn't micromanage the local economy or religion.
It feels almost like a massive franchise model, or even, honestly, a mafia protection racket on a geopolitical scale.
That's a great way to put it.
They basically roll into town, defeat your army, and say, congratulations, you are now part of the Aztec Empire. We don't care what language you speak at home, just make sure the tribute payment arrives in Tenochtitlan every 6 months, or we come back and burn your city to the ground.
That is a very pragmatic and highly accurate way of looking at the logistical reality. The demands for tribute were staggering.
Like, what kind of stuff were they demanding?
Well, the tax rolls we have, like the Codex Mendoza, list massive specific quotas. Thousands of woven cotton cloaks, loads of cacao beans, gold dust, jaguar pelts, exotic feathers, massive amounts of maize and beans.
Just extracting everything of value.
And as we'll discuss later, human captives. As long as this river of wealth flowed uninterrupted into Tenochtitlan, the local kings maintained their autonomy.
And that river of wealth made Tenochtitlan unimaginably rich. The markets there were supposedly larger than anything in Europe at the time.
Absolutely.
But the Mexica didn't just see their capital as a really successful administrative hub or a giant marketplace, did they? They viewed it in deeply cosmic terms.
They viewed Tenochtitlan quite literally as the axis mundi,
The center of everything.
the absolute center of the universe, the point where the earthly realm, the underworld, and the heavens all intersected. The massive Templo Mayor, the great twin pyramids at the very center of the city, wasn't just an impressive piece of monumental architecture.
It was more than just a building.
It was the physical, literal manifestation of their cosmology. It was the sacred mountain where the gods resided.
Okay, but wait. If they started as these marginalized mercenaries hiding out in a swamp, how do they suddenly have this incredibly unified manifest destiny narrative where they are the center of the universe?
It didn't happen by accident.
Right. Someone had to write that narrative. You don't just organically pivot from we are hiding in the mud to we are the divine rulers of the cosmos.
You are touching on one of the most fascinating political maneuvers in the sources. The construction of that narrative was absolutely intentional, and it brings us to a historical figure who is arguably the most important architect of the Aztec Empire that most people have never heard of.
Tlacaelel. The power behind the throne. I was completely captivated by this guy in the reading. He wasn't the emperor himself, right?
No, he was the nephew of an early ruler, Itzcoatl, and half-brother to Moctezuma I.
But the sources describe him essentially as the ultimate Grand Vizier. He held the title of Xiuhpochtli, which is sort of a supreme internal affairs minister and high priest combined.
Yes.
He apparently refused the title of emperor multiple times. He preferred to operate in the shadows, pulling the strings across several different emperors' reigns.
Tlacaelel was a geopolitical genius. He realized that to sustain an empire of that size, you need much more than just strong warriors and sharp weapons. Brute force is expensive and exhausting to maintain.
It runs out eventually.
Right. What you need is a unifying ideology, a shared destiny. According to the historical text, right after the Triple Alliance took power, Tlacaelel initiated a massive systemic cultural reform.
And the most shocking, genuinely chilling part of this reform is how he dealt with the historical record. The sources say he literally ordered the burning of the ancient books.
He did.
He gathered up the painted codices of the conquered peoples and even the historical records of the Mexica themselves and just threw them onto a bonfire.
He essentially wiped the hard drive of Mesoamerican history. The justification he gave, according to the colonial chronicler Sahagún, was that the old books contained lies, and that it wasn't good for the common people to know these things.
Wow, for their own good.
Exactly. But the political reality is clear. He was clearing the slate so he could write a brand new narrative from scratch.
He erased their humble mercenary origins. Because you can't demand tribute from the entire known world if your own history books say you used to be their hired thugs.
You'd be laughed out of the room.
Right. So he manufactured a destiny of greatness. He established a new state religion that placed the Mexica as the chosen people of the sun and war god Huitzilopochtli.
By rewriting history, Tlacaelel centered the Mexica at the very heart of a cosmic struggle. The new curriculum, which was aggressively taught to all scholars, nobles, and commoners, promoted the absolute belief that the Aztecs were always meant to be the masters of the world.
It instilled a sense of unquestionable divine right. It's incredible to think about the mechanics of doing that in the 15th century. It's a classic tool of authoritarian statecraft. If you control the narrative of the past, you ensure compliance in the present.
Exactly right.
If the gods themselves ordained your dominance from the beginning of time, who is a lowly commoner or conquered king for that matter, to question the endless wars or the heavy taxation.
It legitimizes the state's actions, no matter how harsh or extractive they are. It transforms a political war for resources into a holy crusade for cosmic survival.
Which brings up a really crucial question regarding their psychology.
Okay.
If Tlacaelel and the inner circle were basically fabricating their own history to make themselves look invincible, to justify this massive extortion racket, how much of their religious fervor was genuine?
That is the big question.
Were the leaders looking down from the pyramid thinking, I can't believe they were buying this myth we just invented? Or did the leadership eventually buy into their own propaganda? Was it cynical statecraft or genuine religious terror?
That is perhaps the ultimate debate among historians studying this period, and the sources offer very differing interpretations. Some scholars, particularly those analyzing the political economy, lean heavily on the cynical view.
That it was all a con.
Yeah, that the state religion, with all its terrifying demands, was primarily a mechanism of control devised by the elite to keep the masses obedient and the tribute flowing.
But other historians push back on that modern secular interpretation, right?
Strongly. Scholars like Caroline Dodds Pennock caution us against projecting modern political cynicism onto a 15th century indigenous society.
That makes sense. We can't view them through our lens.
Right. She points out that the Aztec worldview was completely, inextricably integrated with the divine. There was no separation of church and state. They were the exact same entity.
So the emperor was basically a pope king.
Yes. It's entirely possible, and perhaps most probable, given the evidence of their daily lives, that the elite genuinely, deeply believed in the cosmic narrative they were promoting, even if they had actively shaped it. To them, political power and divine will were fundamentally indistinguishable.
So they weren't sitting in a smoke-filled room laughing at the commoners. They were terrified too. They believed that if they didn't fulfill their divine role, if they didn't perform the rituals exactly as prescribed, the literal sun would refuse to rise the next morning.
The Mesoamerican cosmology dictated that the universe was highly unstable. They believed they were living in the era of the fifth sun, and that the previous four eras had all ended in spectacular world-ending cataclysms.
So the world had ended 4 times already.
Exactly. And the gods had sacrificed their own blood, throwing themselves into a fire to create this current world and set the sun in motion. Therefore, it was the absolute existential duty of humanity to repay that blood debt to keep the universe from collapsing.
The gods needed nourishment to keep the machinery of the cosmos running.
Precisely.
And that idea of a state-controlled religion, driven by an existential terror of cosmic collapse, perfectly sets the stage for their most infamous and most debated state-sponsored policy. The absolute need to appease the gods through a very specific, highly formalized type of warfare.
We are talking about the Xochitl, the Flower Wars.
The Flower Wars. The name itself is incredibly striking. It sounds almost poetic, delicate. It conjures images of, throwing petals.
It does sound gentle.
But the reality described in the sources is brutal, terrifying, and deeply complex.
To understand why the Flower Wars were instituted, we have to look at the environmental context of the time. According to native historical accounts, a massive, devastating drought gripped the entire basin of Mexico for 4 consecutive years.
4 years.
Right in the middle of the 15th century, from 1450 to 1854.
I want to pause on what a 4-year drought means in an agrarian society dependent on a lake ecosystem. It's not just that the grass turns brown.
No, it's total collapse.
The lake levels drop. The water becomes overly saline and ruins the chanapas. Crops fail completely year after year. Famine sets in. The sources describe people selling themselves or their children into slavery to other tribes just to get a handful of maize. It is a societal apocalypse.
And in a society where the physical environment is deeply tied to human ritual actions, a 4-year drought isn't just bad weather, it's an undeniable signal that the gods are furious.
So the leadership, heavily influenced by Tlacaelel, interpreted this agricultural collapse as divine punishment. The gods specifically, Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, the god of rain, felt unappreciated.
They were starving, and therefore the land was starving.
They needed nourishment to bring the rains back. And in the Aztec cosmology, the ultimate, most potent nourishment for the gods was human blood. the precious water.
So the state needed a massive influx of captives to sacrifice to end the drought. But here's the massive logistical problem they faced. If you are as successful as the Aztec Triple Alliance, and you use your overwhelming military might to conquer all your neighbors and turn them into compliant, tribute-paying subjects, eventually you run out of active enemies to fight.
You essentially conquer yourself into a corner.
Exactly.
If peace breaks out, the supply of prisoners of war dries up.
Mm.
And if the supply of prisoners dries up, the gods starve.
That is the exact dilemma. A culture whose entire cosmological survival depends on the continuous flow of captives fundamentally needs a constant state of war.
It's a terrifying loop.
It is. So the Aztecs made a highly unusual, almost surreal diplomatic arrangement with a few nearby unconquered city-states. Most notably, their bitter, resilient rivals to the east, the Tlaxcalans.
Okay, so what did they do?
They agreed to engage in ritualized, mutually scheduled battles.
Think about the logistics of that for a second. You literally send a messenger to your sworn enemy and say, the gods are hungry on both sides. Are your warriors free next Tuesday to meet at the border for a battle?
It sounds absurd to us.
It really does. The sources describe the rules of these flower wars, and they are incredibly specific. They are the complete opposite of a standard war of conquest.
In a standard campaign, which they called a hard war, the goal is to conquer territory, destroy the enemy's infrastructure, burn down their main temple, and subjugate the population.
Standard military stuff.
Right. The flower wars were completely different. They took place on pre-selected, sacred neutral ground called the Cuatlali.
They actually agreed on the battlefield in advance,
Mm-hmm.
like booking a stadium.
Yes, and both sides would agree exactly how many warriors they were bringing, ensuring a completely equal fight.
Which is wild.
This is almost unheard of in standard military history. The entire point of military strategy is to maneuver to gain an unfair numerical or tactical advantage. To agree to an even fight goes against every tenet of traditional warfare.
And the rules of engagement were entirely different too. They didn't use long-range weapons to soften up the enemy lines. No slingshots raining stones, no apple darts being hurled from a distance.
No, it was strictly limited to close quarters, brutal hand-to-hand combat. Which brings us to the primary weapon used, the macuhuitl.
The Kiwitl. I saw pictures of this in the sources.
The macuhuitl is a fascinating and terrifying piece of military technology. Because the Mesoamericans didn't forge bronze or steel weapons, they relied on wood and stone. The macuhuitl is essentially a flattened wooden club or broadsword.
Almost like a cricket bat.
Yeah, shaped like a cricket bat, but tightly embedded along its edges with incredibly sharp obsidian blades.
Obsidian is volcanic glass. It can hold an edge sharper than modern surgical steel, but it's also incredibly brittle, right?
Yes, and that brittleness is key to how the weapon was used. It's not a steel longsword designed for cleanly lopping off a head or thrusting through armor in the middle of a chaotic melee.
If you hit a bone, the glass breaks.
Exactly. If you hit a solid bone directly, the obsidian blades would shatter or chip. It's designed to slash, to cause massive soft tissue trauma, to disable the opponent's limbs. Because the absolute unbreakable golden rule of the flower war was, you do not kill your enemy on the battlefield if you can possibly help it.
A dead enemy on the battlefield was considered a complete waste of effort.
Totally useless to them.
The entire objective of this highly choreographed violence was to display your martial prowess, physically overcome and exhaust your opponent, pin them down, and capture them alive, so they could be taken across the causeways to Tenochtitlan for ritual sacrifice.
What's fascinating here is the ideological framing of this violence. Because for the Aztecs and for their opponents like the Tlaxcalans, who operated under the exact same religious worldview, dying as a captive on the sacrificial stone after a flower war was not a disgrace.
Not at all.
It was known as sophistication, which translates to flowery death.
It was essentially considered a profoundly honorable, blissful end, a guaranteed ticket to paradise.
Yes. Dying in this manner, or interestingly, dying in childbirth for women, were the only ways to bypass the terrifying, arduous, multi-year journey through the dark underworld of Mictlan that normal souls had to endure.
So it was a fast track to heaven.
Instead, the warrior's soul went straight to the heavens, to the side of the sun god, accompanying the sun on its triumphant daily journey across the sky.
Let me try an analogy here, because wrapping your head around a scheduled war is tough.
Sure.
It feels almost like a highly regulated extreme martial arts tournament.
Yeah.
You agree on the weight class, you agree on the venue, you agree on the rules of engagement, no striking to kill, only to submit.
Right.
But the stakes are utterly existential. You aren't fighting for a plastic trophy. You are fighting for your absolute social standing in your community, and in their minds, you are fighting to literally keep the sun moving. If you lose, you are sacrificed. If you win, you capture someone else to be sacrificed.
That analogy works very well, and it highlights the duality of the flower wars. On the surface, the state framed it as a deeply religious necessity to feed the gods and prevent cosmic collapse. But practically, mechanically, it served incredibly crucial state functions.
Right. It's a massive military training exercise.
Exactly. It provided a continuous live-fire training ground for young soldiers. It allowed the Aztec military apparatus to keep their elite warrior skills incredibly sharp and to test new recruits without the massive logistical drain of mobilizing, feeding, and deploying a full army for a distant, multi-month campaign of territorial conquest.
And beyond training, the sources, like the military historian Ross Hassig, point out that it functioned as a brutal tool of political terror and demographic attrition.
Which is the really sinister part.
Because while the battle itself looked fair with equal numbers on the field, the macro-level reality was entirely asymmetrical. The Aztec Empire was vastly larger than Tlaxcala.
They had way more people.
The Aztecs could easily absorb the steady loss of a few hundred warriors a month. Tlaxcala, being a much smaller encircled state, could not. Over decades, the Aztecs were slowly, methodically bleeding the male population of their rivals dry.
Weakening them year by year without having to commit to a massive, costly siege of your capital.
It was a geopolitical stranglehold completely disguised as a religious festival.
It was brilliant in a terrifying way.
Which begs the question, who is actually out there fighting these wars? Understanding the mechanics of Aztec society reveals why capturing an enemy was quite literally the only way to make a life for yourself in Tenochtitlan.
Aztec society was incredibly rigid. It was a strict, deeply entrenched hierarchy. You had the nobility, known as the Pipiltin, who controlled the land, the government, and the high priesthood.
The top 1%.
And you had the commoners, the Mesoltin, who did the farming, the building, and paid the heavy taxes. You were born into your class, and the laws governing what you could and couldn't do were absolute.
We're talking about strict sumptuary laws. The state literally dictated what you were allowed to wear based on your class.
Yes. A commoner was legally required to wear garments made of rough maguey cactus fiber.
Sounds itchy.
Oh, very. And if a commoner was caught wearing soft cotton or wearing sandals in the capital or building a house above a certain height, the punishment was often death.
For wearing the wrong shirt.
The visual markers of class were legally violently enforced.
But the sources note that despite this rigid divide, every single male, regardless of whether he was a highborn noble or a lowly common farmer, was sent to a state-run school to be trained as a warrior. War was universal.
It was the absolute defining characteristic of Aztec masculinity and civic duty. But here is the crucial logistical detail regarding upward mobility. For a commoner, there was no amount of wealth you could accumulate as a merchant, no amount of extra land you could farm, that would organically elevate you to the noble class.
No getting rich and buying your way in.
Nope. The one and only ladder up the social hierarchy was military success. And military success was defined by one highly specific metric: taking live captives on the battlefield.
It's basically a gamified system of social progression. If you went to war and captured one enemy alive, you were allowed to wear a certain type of finely woven cloak. If you captured two, you were permitted to wear sandals and perhaps a more ornate tunic.
You literally level up.
And if you managed to capture 4 enemies alive over your career, you crossed a major threshold. You could enter the elite military orders, the revered eagle and jaguar warriors.
Achieving that rank fundamentally changed your life. You gained access to better food, immense social prestige, you didn't have to pay certain taxes, and you gained a seat at the council table. You became a member of the lower nobility through sheer merit.
This creates a profound psychological element to the warfare. War wasn't just an abstract concept of protecting distant borders or serving an emperor you'd never met. It was deeply, desperately personal.
It was an absolute economic and social imperative for every young man.
And because of that intense personal investment, the relationship between the captor and the captive was completely unique. It wasn't simply one of hatred or malice.
No, it was strangely intimate.
This is one of the details in the sources that really threw me, because it is so counterintuitive to how we think of war. When an Aztec warrior finally wrestled his opponent to the ground, exhausted, bleeding, and tied him up, they didn't spit on them. They didn't torture them on the field. They instantly established a sacred, almost familial kinship.
It's fascinating.
The sources say the captor would look at the prisoner and call him son, and the bound prisoner would respond, calling his captor father.
It's a psychological mechanism that underscores the sacrificial logic. The scholar Christian Duverger and others have analyzed this deeply. They suggest that the offerer, the Aztec warrior, who is essentially paying the blood debt to the gods on behalf of the state, needed to deliver someone of his own nature, a true substitute for himself.
Right.
By taking the captive symbolically becomes an extension of the warrior's own body and spirit.
So when the captive is eventually taken up the pyramid and sacrificed, it is as if the warrior is offering a piece of his own soul.
Exactly. The religious framework demanded a profound level of identification with the victim. It wasn't about exterminating a hated enemy. It was about preparing a divine messenger.
Which explains another bizarre logistical detail. After the sacrifice, the body was often tumbled down the temple steps, retrieved by the warrior's family, and parts of it were cooked in a stew with maize for a ritual meal.
But there was a strict rule.
Right. The warrior who actually captured the prisoner was strictly forbidden from eating the flesh, because you cannot consume your own son. You cannot consume a symbolic piece of yourself.
It was a deeply ingrained bond forged in the chaotic violence of the battlefield. The captive even lived in the captor's home for days or weeks before the festival, being treated with immense respect, almost reverence, before the end.
But I want to pause and speculate on the societal mechanics of this for a second, because the implications are staggering. If the only way for a young man to get a promotion, to secure his family's future, to wear decent clothes without being executed, is to capture an enemy, then the entire society structurally requires a never-ending supply of enemies.
That is the fatal flaw in the Aztec machine. The society was structurally addicted to warfare.
They literally couldn't afford peace.
If they ever achieved total peace, the entire social mobility engine of the empire would grind to a dead halt. A whole generation of young men would have no way to advance.
They could never fully assimilate or destroy all their rivals. To do so would eliminate the proving grounds for their youth and the fuel for their religious cosmology. The system naturally, inevitably perpetuated endless conflict.
And we shouldn't underestimate the sheer physical difficulty of what this system demanded.
Right. I want to push back on the reality of this combat. Think about the sensory overload of a Mesoamerican battlefield. The screaming, the drums, the sheer crush of bodies. Someone is swinging a heavy wooden club studded with razor-sharp glass at your head.
It's terrifying.
Isn't it infinitely harder to capture a highly trained, desperate soldier alive than to simply thrust a spear into his chest and end it? Pinning a struggling man to the dirt and tying his hands while a battle is raging all around you requires an unbelievable amount of skill, restraint, and sheer physical dominance.
It is exceptionally difficult, and that was entirely the point of the system. It was the ultimate, undeniable demonstration of martial superiority. Killing an enemy from 50 yots away with a slingstone proved nothing about your courage, your strength, or your divine favor.
Too easy.
Wrestling an equally matched jaguar warrior to the earth, subduing him without killing him, and marching him miles back to Tenochtitlan alive, that proved you were a man worthy of the highest honors the state could bestow.
And that constant influx of captives brought back across the causeways, paraded through the streets, living with their captors, brings us to the ultimate, inevitable destination for these prisoners.
The sacrificial altar.
And this is where we hit the most massive, polarized historical debate in all of Mesoamerican history. What actually happened at the top of the Templo Mayor?
To really dive into this, we have to confront the grisly accounts left behind by the Spanish chroniclers, and then we have to meticulously pick them apart using modern archaeological science and mathematical logic.
Okay, let's do it.
The most famous, or perhaps infamous, event detailed in the colonial sources is the grand dedication of the expansion of the Templo Mayor in the year 1487 under the reign of the Emperor Ahuitzotl.
The numbers reported for this single festival are just mind-boggling. The Spanish sources, primarily relying on later accounts by friars like Diego Duran, claim that the Aztecs sacrificed 80,400 people over the course of just 4 days to consecrate the temple.
80,000.
80,400 captives. It's a huge number.
Let's actually do the math on that for a moment, because human brains struggle to comprehend numbers that large without context. 4 days is 96 hours. That's 5,760 minutes.
Okay.
To sacrifice 80,400 individuals in that time frame, the Aztec priests would have had to process approximately 14 sacrifices every single minute, nonstop, day and night, without a single break for 4 consecutive days.
14 a minute. So 1 every 4 seconds. Let's visualize the physical space.
Right.
You have 4 priests holding a captive down by the limbs over a convex stone.
Right.
A 5th priest makes the incision, removes the heart, holds it up to the sun, and then they have to move a limp, heavy body out of the way, tumble it down steep, narrow stairs, clean the stone, and bring the next struggling captive up.
It's a lot of steps.
Doing that entirely complex physical process every 4 seconds, it is logistically, physically impossible.
The bottleneck on the stairs alone would have completely stopped the process. The sheer volume of blood would have made the temple summit completely unworkable. Even historians who fully acknowledge the massive scale of Aztec state violence, like Ross Hassig, consider that 80,400 number to be a wild, politically motivated exaggeration.
So what's a more realistic number?
Hassig suggests a number closer to 10,000 to 20,000 for that specific event.
Which, to be fair, is still a staggering, horrifying amount of ritual violence. We aren't trying to sanitize history here.
No, absolutely not.
But 10,000 is physically plausible over multiple temples across the city. 80,000 on one temple is a physical impossibility.
Exactly. And when we turn from the 16th century texts written by the people who conquered the Aztecs, to modern archaeological evidence, the picture changes even more dramatically.
Right, let's look at the physical evidence, the Temple Mayor Project. Archaeologists have been meticulously excavating the very center of Mexico City, digging down into the ruins of Tenochtitlan for over 4 decades now.
A massive project.
If there were tens of thousands of people sacrificed every single year over the course of a century, the ground beneath Mexico City should be literally packed with millions of human bones.
And it simply isn't. The Urban Archaeology Program has done incredibly thorough work there. Over all the various construction stages of the Templo Mayor and its adjoining sacred precinct, they have found the remains of roughly 1,000 individuals definitively associated with ritual sacrifice.
That's 1,000 individuals over the course of many decades, not 80,000 in a single weekend.
Now, again, we must acknowledge that 1,000 people ritually killed in a temple precinct is a massive amount of state violence. The massive skull racks, the Zompantli, where heads were displayed on wooden poles, have been found by archaeologists.
The physical reality is there.
The sacrificial stones, the Tecatl, have been excavated. The physical reality of the violence is undeniable, but the scale is orders of magnitude smaller than the apocalyptic numbers the Spanish claimed in their reports back to Europe.
And the science goes even deeper than just counting skulls. There is an incredibly fascinating detail in the sources regarding isotope analysis.
Yes, isotopic analysis of the bones is changing the narrative entirely. By analyzing the stable isotopes of elements like strontium and oxygen in the tooth enamel and bones of the victims, scientists can determine where a person lived for different periods of their life.
It's like a chemical timeline.
It's essentially a geological fingerprint left by the food they ate and the water they drank.
So the Spanish narrative, the one that made it into all the history books, claimed the Aztecs were constantly sweeping through neighboring states, gathering up massive herds of fresh prisoners of war, dragging them back to the city, and immediately marching them up the pyramids to the slaughter.
But the isotopes reveal something completely counter to that fast-paced narrative. The bones show that a significant portion of these victims had lived in Tenochtitlan or the immediate valley for years before their deaths.
Years.
Yes, years.
They weren't fresh captives dragged directly off a battlefield covered in mud. They had been assimilated into the city. They had been eating the local maize, drinking the local water, living among the population for a long time.
This paints a fundamentally different picture of the ritual. It suggests a process that was highly managed, heavily scheduled, and deeply integrated into the annual religious calendar.
So it wasn't just a frenzy.
It wasn't a spontaneous, chaotic blood frenzy of newly captured enemies. It was a slow, deliberate theological process.
Which brings us to the heavily debated theories in the sources regarding why they performed these sacrifices, even on a smaller scale. If the gods needed blood, why do they go to such elaborate lengths?
The sources present some very divergent, highly controversial perspectives that we need to outline.
Let's start with perhaps the most controversial modern theory. Back in the late 1970s, an anthropologist named Michael Harner proposed what became known as the ecological or protein deficiency theory of Aztec sacrifice.
Okay, what's that about? He basically argued that the Valley of Mexico had a massive, booming human population, millions of people, but the environment crucially lacked large domesticated herbivores. There were no cows, no pigs, no sheep, no horses in the Americas before the Spanish arrived.
Right.
Because of this lack of large livestock, Harner theorized that the population was starving for essential amino acids. They were protein deficient. He postulated that human sacrifice and the highly ritualized cannibalism that accompanied it among the elite was essentially an extreme ecological adaptation.
Wow.
He argued it was a biological mechanism to supplement the diet of the warrior class with human flesh because animal meat was too scarce to sustain an army.
That's a deeply cynical theory. It views this highly complex religious civilization essentially as a society of butchers driven by basic biological hunger, hiding behind the guise of religion.
It does.
But the sources we have push back on this ecological theory incredibly hard.
Very hard. Other scholars, particularly those analyzing the extensive work of the colonial friar Bernardino de Sahagún, note that the Aztec diet was actually incredibly rich, diverse, and calorically dense.
No one starving?
They had massive agricultural yields of maize, beans, squash, and amaranth. They harvested spirulina algae from the lake, which is incredibly high in protein. They ate turkeys, ducks, endless varieties of fish, amphibians, and domestic dogs. There was no protein crisis in the Valley of Mexico.
The consensus among modern historians and anthropologists is that Harner's theory completely strips away the indigenous perspective and ignores the mountain of evidence regarding their sophisticated agriculture.
Right.
More importantly, it ignores the deeply held religious paradigm entirely.
Okay.
The consumption of flesh was strictly a ritualized, highly restricted communion among the elite and the warriors. It was about spiritually absorbing the divine essence of the victim, who had been ritually transformed into an exiptla, a living representative of the god.
It was theological communion, not an attempt to fill a caloric deficit.
But here's where it gets really interesting. We have the standard religious theory feeding the sun. We have the debunked ecological theory. But the sources also present a deeply provocative legal perspective. There's a fascinating paper from Leiden University that suggests we might be fundamentally mistranslating what we are seeing in the pre-Columbian art and the colonial texts.
The Leiden researchers propose a crucial shift in context. They point out that when a modern observer or a 16th century Spanish friar looks at indigenous codices depicting a priest standing over a body, cutting out a heart, they are viewing it through a lens heavily colored by centuries of European colonial bias.
Oh, absolutely.
The Spanish immediately reflexively labeled all these acts as heathen sacrifices to demons.
Because that fit their worldview.
Exactly.
But the Leiden paper argues that much of what the Spanish broadly categorized as human sacrifice was, in fact, the Aztec state carrying out a highly ritualized, legally mandated form of capital punishment, or the formal execution of rebellious prisoners of war.
It's an incredibly important distinction to consider. If a complex society kills a thief, a murderer, or an enemy combatant according to its own strict penal codes, and does so in a highly public, ritually significant location like the steps of the main temple, is that a human sacrifice? Or is it a state execution wrapped in religious iconography?
I mean, let's think about contemporary Europe at that exact same moment in history. The Spanish Inquisition was actively burning people alive at the stake for heresy in public squares.
Right.
English monarchs were hanging, drawing, and quartering political enemies, ripping their entrails out while they were still alive, and displaying their severed heads on wooden spikes on London Bridge as a warning.
Also highly public and violent.
Was that human sacrifice to the Christian God? Or was it the European state exercising its ultimate legal and political authority to maintain order?
The mechanics of the state violence are remarkably similar across the ocean. It's public spectacle, it involves severe bodily mutilation, it's state-sanctioned death, and it's heavily tied to religious orthodoxy.
So why the double standard?
Because the Aztecs were an alien, indigenous culture worshipping unfamiliar gods with unpronounceable names, the Spanish conquerors framed their state executions entirely as irrational, demonic bloodlust.
The Leiden researchers make a very sharp point here. Framing the Aztecs as a functioning state, executing criminals wouldn't have served the conquistadors' purpose at all. You can't legally justify invading a sovereign nation and stealing their gold just because they have a harsh death penalty.
No, because Spain had a harsh death penalty too.
Exactly.
They needed the Aztecs to be a unique, terrifying, incomprehensible evil.
Which brings us perfectly to the arrival of the Spanish in 1519 and the massive high-stakes propaganda war that ensued. Because if the numbers of sacrifices were wildly mathematically exaggerated and the legal context of the violence was deliberately obscured, we have to ask the critical question.
Why?
Why did Hernán Cortés and his chroniclers feel the need to exaggerate so heavily? What were the logistical mechanics of their propaganda?
To understand the intense motivations of Hernan Cortés, we have to zoom out from the Valley of Mexico and look at the geopolitical, legal, and theological climate of Europe at the turn of the 16th century. In 1493, right after Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Caribbean, Pope Alexander VI issued a massive papal decree, a papal bull known as Inter Cetera.
This document is essentially the foundational legal framework for the entire European colonization of the Americas.
It was. The Pope, acting as the ultimate spiritual and political authority in Europe, formally granted the crowns of Spain and Portugal the exclusive privilege to take possession of the lands in the New World.
But, and this is the crucial part, that immense grant of global power came with a massive explicit condition.
A huge string attached.
The sole legal and moral justification for invading and claiming these lands was a mandate to indoctrinate these natives and inhabitants in the Catholic faith and impose the good ways upon them. The Spanish were legally required to act as the righteous defenders and expanders of Christianity.
So, the Spanish crown required conquistadors to read a document called the Requerimiento before attacking indigenous people. It basically told them to submit to the Pope and the King, or the ensuing violence was their own fault.
Wow, just covering their legal bases.
And here is where we must maintain our strict impartiality, looking only at the political mechanics the sources describe. For Cortés, encountering the Aztec Empire presented a massive, terrifying legal and moral problem.
It was a crisis for him. When Cortés marched over the mountains and saw Tenochtitlan, he wasn't looking at a collection of simple huts. He was looking at a sprawling, hyper-organized, incredibly wealthy metropolis that rivaled European capitals.
It blew their minds.
The Aztecs had complex codified laws, beautiful poetry, highly accurate astronomical calendars, sophisticated botanical gardens, and a deeply entrenched social hierarchy.
Under the legal and theological frameworks of 16th century Europe, conquering a complex, fully functioning civilization purely for profit was highly legally dubious and morally complicated back in the courts of Spain. If the Aztecs were just another advanced nation, coming into their capitals, slaughtering their leaders, and emptying their treasuries was simply theft and unprovoked murder.
Furthermore, Cortés was in profound personal legal jeopardy. He had launched this expedition to Mexico from Cuba in direct defiance of the Spanish governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez.
He was literally going rogue.
Cortés was essentially a rogue agent. He was actively committing mutiny and treason. If he failed, or if he couldn't legally justify his actions to the King of Spain, he would be hanged as a traitor.
So he needs a justification so powerful that the king will forgive his treason. If the Aztecs are a civilized nation, he's a pirate. But if the Aztecs are bloodthirsty, irredeemable monsters.
If they are driven by literal demons to endlessly slaughter innocent people and consume their flesh in satanic orgies,
then conquering them is no longer a crime of piracy. It transforms into a righteous holy crusade. It becomes a moral imperative to save innocent souls from demonic subjugation.
so they created the monsters they needed to fight.
The conquistadors needed the Aztecs to be the ultimate, cartoonish evil in order to justify their own violent actions to the Spanish crown, to the Pope, and perhaps even to their own consciences.
The narrative of the satanic man-eater was the perfect and arguably the only justification available to save Cortés's neck. And the sources detail how Cortés actively, methodically built this narrative in his famous letters back to Emperor Charles V.
He was very deliberate about it.
He wrote explicitly that the Aztecs had a horrid and abominable custom of sacrificing innocent girls and boys, tearing open their chests while they were still alive. He declared eradicating this practice as the primary noble reason for his unauthorized conquest.
It was a brilliantly effective public relations campaign. But we also see the deep hypocrisy of this framing pointed out by scholars and contemporaries. Take Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who lived contemporaneously and became one of the first and fiercest advocates for indigenous rights.
Las Casas is a fascinating figure in the sources. He didn't mince words.
He explicitly argued in his writings that the horrific tales of mass sacrifice and rampant cannibalism were gross fabrications spread by Cortés and his men. Las Casas claimed they invented these stories simply to excuse his crimes and to legally justify the violence, cruelties, robberies, and massacres that the Spanish themselves were actively perpetrating across the continent.
Let's compare the atrocities directly, based strictly on what the historical sources outline. The Spanish accounts claim they were absolutely horrified, sickened to their core by the Aztec Somtantli, the towering wooden racks where the thousands of skulls of sacrificial victims or executed prisoners were displayed in the temple precinct.
They pointed to this architecture as undeniable proof of absolute, irredeemable barbarism.
Yet, as we discussed with the Leiden paper, contemporary Europe was entirely awash in its own forms of highly ritualized public violence. But it goes beyond just European domestic policy. During the actual conquest of Mexico itself, the Spanish chroniclers describe how the conquistadors committed horrific, terror-inducing acts of violence to subjugate the population.
They weren't just fighting honorable battles. The sources describe them routinely cutting off the hands of captured indigenous spies and sending them back to their camps.
That's horrifying.
They conducted a massive, unprovoked, preemptive massacre of thousands of unarmed nobles and priests in the courtyard of the city of Cholula. They routinely burned indigenous leaders alive at the stake for refusing to hand over gold or convert to Christianity.
There's a very famous, chilling illustration mentioned in the sources, created by the European engraver Theodore de Bry. It depicts the conquistadors carrying out mass executions of native people. The illustration shows them hanging indigenous victims in groups of 13, a number specifically chosen to honor Jesus, and the 12 apostles, and lighting wood fires beneath their feet as they strangled.
It's incredibly grim.
The sources point out this stark historical hypocrisy here. The conquistadors were expressing profound, righteous horror at Aztec religious violence, using it as a pretext for invasion, while simultaneously and actively perpetrating their own massive, religiously tinged atrocities in the name of the Spanish crown.
It's a classic case of projection, in a way.
But I do want to push back a little here
Yeah.
and play devil's advocate for the sake of the narrative. We are looking back with 500 years of hindsight. Let's put ourselves in the muddy boots of a Spanish soldier arriving in 1519. Is it possible that the Spanish genuinely, truly didn't understand what they were seeing?
That's a fair question.
Europe at this time was deep in the throes of absolute hysteria over witches and demons. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum were highly popular, detailing how witches supposedly ate babies and literally worshipped the devil.
That is a very valid psychological nuance to introduce.
Right. Is it possible Cortés and the rank-and-file soldiers weren't just being entirely cynical propagandists, but were bringing their own genuine, deeply ingrained European fears of witchcraft into a completely alien religious system?
It's highly likely they were terrified.
They walk into a dark temple smelling of copal incense. They see a stone statue of Huitzilopochtli covered in the dried blood of a ritual killing, and their medieval cultural conditioning immediately screams, "Demons?" They literally lacked the anthropological framework to see it any other way.
The historical texts absolutely acknowledge that dynamic. The concept of confirmation bias is heavily discussed in the modern analysis of colonial encounters. The Spaniards arrived on the shores of Mexico already expecting to find savages, cannibals, and literal devil worshippers.
That's what they were told was out there.
That is what centuries of medieval European literature and their previous violent encounters with tribes in the Caribbean had primed them to see. When they saw the blood on the Templo Mayor, their pre-existing terrified worldview was instantly validated.
They didn't pause to ask a local priest about the nuanced cosmological significance of the fifth sun or the concept of the axis mundi. They saw blood, they smelled death, and they saw hellfire.
Precisely. But the historical analysis points out that regardless of whether the narrative started as a genuine, terrified cultural misunderstanding or as a cold, cynical political calculation by Cortés, the result was exactly the same. The narrative of the bloodthirsty savage was solidified, codified in official reports, and deployed as a devastating weapon.
Cortés used the visceral horror of human sacrifice to motivate his own terrified men. He told them they had to fight to the death because if they surrendered, they would end up on the sacrificial stone. And he used it to justify the total systematic destruction of Aztec culture, architecture, and religion.
That irreconcilable clash of narratives, the Spanish belief in their holy civilizing mission versus the Aztec belief in their existential cosmic duty, sets the stage for the brutal military reality that finally brought about the collapse of the Aztec world. Which leads us to the final section of our deep dive, the actual mechanical fall of the empire.
When we talk about the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the popular myth that gets repeated is often that a few hundred brave, technologically superior Spaniards with steel swords, a few cannons, and some horses, easily toppled a massive, primitive empire.
But the sources we are looking at explicitly and thoroughly dismantle that myth. The Spanish weapons, the Toledo steel, harquebuses, the cavalry, they certainly played a tactical role in specific battles, but they were absolutely not the primary strategic cause of the Aztec collapse.
No way.
A few hundred men with single-shot muskets cannot conquer a city of 250,000 defended by hundreds of thousands of veteran warriors.
The Aztecs were largely undone by their own neighbors. And this is where the story brilliantly, tragically circles back to the very policies that made them so powerful in the first place. We have to return to the logistics of the Flower Wars.
The chickens came home to roost.
Big time.
For over 60 years, the Aztec Triple Alliance had been waging these ritualistic, predatory wars of attrition against nearby states. And their primary target, as we discussed, was Tlaxcala.
Right, their captive farm.
The Aztecs had essentially kept the Tlaxcalan Republic alive, surrounded, economically blockaded, and under constant threat, using it purely as a captive breeding farm to supply the sacrificial altars of Tenochtitlan.
I want you to imagine the generational trauma that policy would inflict. Imagine the deep, boiling, bitter resentment that would breed within a society. 6 decades of your brothers, your fathers, your sons being repeatedly marched off to die on foreign altars by an arrogant empire that demands tribute.
When Cortés arrived on the coast in 1519, he didn't find a politically unified nation of Mexico ready to repel an invader. He found a heavily fragmented political landscape, an empire composed of disgruntled, heavily taxed vassal states, boiling over with intense hatred for the Mexico overlords in Tenochtitlan.
Cortés, whatever his moral failings, was a brilliant political opportunist. He recognized this fractured landscape immediately and exploited it perfectly.
He knew exactly what buttons to push.
The Tlaxcalans, after initially fighting a fierce battle against the Spanish to test their strength, quickly realized the geopolitical geometry of the situation. They realized that these heavily armored newcomers could be the blunt instrument they needed to finally destroy their Aztec tormentors. They forged a massive military alliance with Cortés.
And we are not talking about the Tlaxcalans providing a few local guides or porters. The sources indicate the Tlaxcalans, along with other disaffected city-states like Texcoco who switched sides, provided tens of thousands of seasoned, highly motivated warriors to the Spanish cause.
Tens of thousands.
The final brutal siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was less a Spanish conquest and much more a massive continent-shaking indigenous civil war and rebellion. The Spanish merely acted as the heavily armored spearhead for a massive native army.
It's an incredible historical irony. The very institution of the Flower Wars, which was explicitly designed by Aztec leadership like Tlaxcala to ensure their cosmic survival, train their elite warriors, and physically demonstrate their absolute military dominance over their neighbors. That exact institution bred the intense resentment that provided the Spanish with the willing, highly trained indigenous allies they desperately needed to overthrow the empire.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Aztecs' own geopolitical strategy of ruling through terror and extraction sealed their fate. It is a classic, almost Shakespearean tragedy. The very mechanisms that made them feel invincible and divinely favored became their fatal Achilles heel. But we must also note that even with tens of thousands of angry Tlaxcalan allies, capturing Tenochtitlan was a nightmare.
Right, it's an island fortress. It's accessible only by narrow causeways that the Aztecs could easily break apart. The Spanish and their allies were bogged down in brutal house-to-house, canal-by-canal fighting for months. The city should have been nearly impregnable.
And it very likely would have been were it not for the invisible, completely unintentional vanguard that accompanied the Spanish across the ocean. A biological apocalypse.
Disease. The ultimate deciding factor in the conquest of the Americas.
Specifically, the variola virus. Smallpox. In 1520, about a year before the final siege began, a wave of smallpox swept through Tenochtitlan and the surrounding valleys.
And they had no defense against it.
Because the indigenous populations of the Americas had been geographically isolated from the rest of the world for over 10,000 years, and because they lacked the dense populations of domesticated livestock where these zoonotic diseases originated, they had absolutely zero genetic or acquired immunity to European pathogens.
The mortality numbers detailed in the epidemiological sources are almost impossible to fathom. The virus burned through the dense urban population like wildfire. Between 5 and 8 million indigenous people died in that first wave alone.
It was a catastrophic, rapid collapse of the societal structure, and it didn't discriminate. It didn't just kill frontline warriors. It killed the farmers tending the chinampas. It killed the seasoned generals, the high priests, the emperors, the mothers, the children. It hollowed out the entire empire from the inside in a matter of months.
So when Cortez and his massive army of Tlaxcalan allies finally laid siege to the city in the summer of 1521, they weren't fighting the Aztec Empire at the height of its power. They were fighting a decimated population that was already starving, lacking leadership, and ravaged by a horrific plague they couldn't understand.
The city finally fell in August of 1521. The great Templo Mayor, the Axis Mundi, was systematically dismantled by the conquerors. Its sacred volcanic stones were reused to build the foundations of a new Catholic cathedral and the palaces of a new Spanish colonial capital, which became Mexico City. The Aztec Empire, which had blazed so brightly and violently for a century, was extinguished.
So what does this all mean? After dissecting this massive stack of sources, after digging into the engineering, the politics, the religion, and the propaganda, what is the core takeaway for us? How do we synthesize all of this?
The essential takeaway is that history is incredibly layered, and the most dramatic black and white narratives are almost always the most suspect. The Aztec Empire was an undeniable marvel of human engineering, political administration, and complex culture. They built a sprawling, incredibly sophisticated civilization in a highly challenging aquatic environment.
And regarding their infamous reputation for extreme violence, how do we balance that?
The practice of ritual killing, the state execution of captives in a religious setting, was undeniably a reality. It was deeply rooted in their intricate cosmology and a profound, terrifying belief that they owed a literal blood debt to the gods to keep the universe functioning. But the historical evidence strongly indicates that the scale of that violence was vastly, intentionally exaggerated by the Spanish conquerors.
The conquistadors encountered a reality, a complex indigenous state that utilized ritualized execution, and they aggressively inflated it into a cartoonish horror story. A story of millions of innocent victims being slaughtered by demon worshippers.
Which was so convenient for them.
And they used this heavily manipulated narrative as a legal and moral shield to justify their own brutal conquest, the destruction of an entire vibrant culture, and the initiation of the colonization of an entire continent.
Furthermore, the Aztecs' own geopolitical choices, particularly their reliance on extractive tribute and the terror of the flower wars to subjugate their neighbors, fatally fractured the region politically. They created the exact environment of resentment that provided the Spanish with the local tools they needed to execute that conquest.
It is a profound, deeply complex story of how political power, religious fervor, environmental disaster, and calculated propaganda all intersect to shape the destiny of millions. Which leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
I love a good lingering thought.
We often repeat the phrase that history is written by the victors. We've just spent an hour uncovering the intricate mechanics of how effectively the Spanish framed the narrative of the Aztec Empire to hide their own imperial motives, creating a myth of the bloodthirsty savage that successfully dominated history books for 5 centuries.
Half a millennium of propaganda.
Exactly. So if a 500-year-old propaganda campaign can so thoroughly, so completely shape our global understanding of the past, what widely accepted historical facts about our world today are actually just the remnants of someone else's highly successful propaganda. What other complex histories are sitting in the archives just waiting to be unwritten?